Hello, I'm here with Michele Acuto from University College London. And Michele, what do you understand diplomacy to be?
Right, big question. We could definitely go historical, we won't go historical. I'd say I tend to stick with sort of I said I wouldn't go historical, but I'll go historical. A Harold Nicholson type cut of sort of the mediated or negotiated relations between representatives. But I wouldn't get stuck at representatives of states. So in a sense, easiest definition, the one that I used to teach generally tends to be mediated or negotiated relations between representatives of polities in the sense of political communities. So you can speak of a diplomacy of the European Union or a diplomacy of the United States, but you can also speak of a diplomacy of a city, a region, like the diplomacy of Quebec, for instance, and so forth.
Okay. And what do you think constitutes successful diplomacy?
Interesting. I think there I would have to then differentiate whether we're talking about diplomacy in a strict sense, so in a sense basically what we just said in terms of sort of the role of representing a political community, which would then would tie success to the successful representation of that political community's interest and role in a specific context. If we're but there are modes of diplomacy, say like simply mediation, where the mediator's role remain more tied to a successful negotiation rather than an outcome of the negotiation. So in that case, they'll be a bit trickier, but it'd be a successful connection between whatever parties they're representing.
Okay. And conversely, how do you sort of contend with failure in diplomacy? What constitutes failure? When does diplomacy not work? I would say that you would see spectacular failures, clearly, but not that often. Spectacular failures in complete breakdown of relationships, complete breakdown of some form of regulated or basic order. I think one interesting question is whether you assess the failure of diplomacy at the end of the diplomatic act, if you wish, so at the establishment of a treaty, or if you assess diplomacy post facto, say, a few years down the line or a little bit of time down the line. So the argument of the diplomacy of the Kimberley process on certifying diamonds established a global process to make sure that there wouldn't be any masses of blood diamonds floating about. But a few years down the line, the process has fallen apart. It's not complying with itself. And if you look at, for instance, the diplomacy of the landmine treaty in 1997, you can argue that more than 10 years down the line, more than 20 years down the line, it still is being implemented. It prevents from certain states from using landmines. It sort of helps victims. So I would argue there's an argument for successful of the diplomatic act versus successful of the diplomatic negotiation and its outcomes. You press you a little further on that in the sort of timeline, and I said, you said you weren't going to get too historical, but there's clearly a temporal dimension of diplomacy, and how do you see that playing out?
There is, yeah. I would say I wouldn't get too historical on terminology itself, because you could go literally back forever, as long as there's been political relations in humanity, there probably has been diplomacy. I think there's a temporal dimension as to the single case or diplomatic instance that we're looking at. So for instance, as I was saying, processes where there's multiple negotiations, they sort of drag through time. But there's also a temporal dimension in the diplomatic practice itself. So if you go and teach diplomacy, you would probably teach about time management. So in a sense, it's sort of multi-scalar temporal. It's getting a bit meta. But if you know what I mean, in a sense, it's really about management of time, is about post and pre-diplomacy and sort of what happens years down the line.
I mean, what I'm taking from that is that, the complexity of diplomacy requires something of the sort of understanding of both the longue durée and the immediacy of the act that we're discussing.
Absolutely. I mean, the good schools of diplomacy would possibly separate that in a sense. They would give you a course of cases of diplomacy,
where you would be forced to think about, I don't know, the diplomacy of the League of Nations and how it relates to the diplomacy of the United Nations and how it relates to the diplomacy of the European Union. It's different instantiation of the same type of diplomacy. To those courses that teach you sort of more, I would argue there's a difference between diplomacy and time and diplomacy and time management, which is more sort of in the act itself, a skill of the diplomat.
And thinking about diplomats who you've come across, maybe personally or studied, who are the diplomats who you sort of look to as being particularly skillful proprietors of diplomatic practice?
I thought about it when you mentioned the question, and I thought, potentially if I stick to my basic line, the best diplomats, I wouldn't be able to see them, simply because they would be doing such a good job of maintaining a functional and peaceful order that the answer wouldn't be the classics like Kissinger, or I wouldn't go to the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you Google best example of diplomacy, you probably get the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then I would think, what about whoever worked on the Treaty of Jaffa in the Crusades, and the fact that maintained peace for X amount of years. It's an old example, but it worked. And the name of the diplomat itself subsides the act of creating or maintaining stability, in a sense.
So Michele, where else have you seen diplomacy in action?
So I'm going to say something about cities or paradiplomacy. I guess that what a particular interest of mine is the fact that if we don't limit ourselves to diplomacy being proprietary to states, then you see a vast amount of diplomatic activity all over the place, below or above potentially the state. So throwing a number, the diplomacy of cities, there's at least 180 to 200 city networks globally. That means that there's at least 200 cases in which cities relate to other cities internationally. So, for instance, you have the mayor of Rio negotiating a joint cycling scheme with London and Sydney. Now, clearly they're representing the interest of their political community, the citizens, and clearly that seems diplomatic enough to me. It just simply doesn't get on the headlines of diplomacy very often.
Thank you very much.
A pleasure.